Have you ever imagined what it would be like to live in a city where fear ruled every corner? In an empire where the lives of millions depended on the mood of a single man, Nero, the cruelest emperor in Roman history, turned glory into chaos, lust into tragedy, and made even the most powerful tremble at his fury. Today we'll delve into the mind of this tyrant, who marked Rome with fire, blood, and terror, and reveal how his reign shaped the destiny of the greatest empire of antiquity. Get ready to uncover the dark secrets behind one of the most feared names in history. Imagine a 16-year-old boy sitting on the throne of the largest empire the world had ever seen. He was no ordinary leader. He was Nero, the last emperor of a dynasty that shaped Rome. His youth, combined with the responsibility of ruling millions, seemed like an invitation to chaos, and that's exactly what happened. Nero rose to power in 54 AD, a time when Rome craved stability. His name was tied to the legendary lineage of the Julio-Claudians, the same that had given the world leaders like Augustus, the great architect of the empire. However, Nero was far from following in the footsteps of these giants. While the Romans placed their hopes in him, he would lead them into an era of tyranny and fear. When Nero became emperor, the city of Rome breathed a mix of optimism and curiosity. He was young, charismatic, and initially seemed eager to connect with the people. But what many didn't know was that behind this jovial smile lay a web of manipulation. Surrounding him were two influential figures shaping his decisions: his mother, Agrippina, and his tutor, the philosopher Seneca. Agrippina was a woman capable of moving mountains to achieve her goals. She orchestrated every step that brought Nero to the throne, believing she would rule alongside or through him. Meanwhile, Seneca was the philosophical mind trying to teach Nero to govern wisely, but he would soon discover that controlling such a restless spirit was an impossible task. Have you ever tried to unravel what made Rome the greatest empire in the world, only to get lost in a flood of details? Don't worry, you're not alone. Imagine finally mastering the most decisive moments of Roman history, learning about the brilliant strategies of generals like Julius Caesar and Scipio Africanus, and understanding how their tactics shaped the destiny of the world. With this in mind, I created the digital book, The 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire, where you'll gain access to a clear, objective analysis full of exclusive curiosities. Discover how Rome won battles considered impossible and become a true expert in Roman military history. Don't waste time. Click on the pinned comment and get your copy now. Take advantage before the copies run out. In the early years of Nero's reign, he even tried to please the people. He restored some of the Senate's power and walked the streets as if he were one of us. But soon tensions began to grow, especially between him and Agrippina. She wanted to remain the most powerful figure in the empire, but Nero, with his thirst for freedom, began to rebel. He wanted to be seen as the sole leader of Rome, without puppets pulling the strings. This internal conflict escalated to an irreversible point. For Nero, breaking free from his mother's influence was essential. For Agrippina, maintaining control over her son was a matter of political survival. The result of this battle would become one of the darkest events of Nero's government. And then came the tragedy that would seal Nero's fate in the eyes of history: the Great Fire of Rome. It was a stifling night in July of 64 AD when the fire began spreading through the city's alleys. The flames danced like ravenous creatures, consuming everything in their path. For 6 days, the heart of the empire burned. Thousands of people lost their homes, their lives, and their hopes. While Rome burned, rumors began to spread. It was said that Nero had been seen on his balcony, playing a lyre and composing verses about the destruction. Was it true? Perhaps we will never know. But what matters is that this image became the essence of his reputation: a leader disconnected from his people and immersed in his own pleasures. To free himself from the guilt that loomed over him, Nero needed to find someone to blame. He chose the Christians, a minority already viewed with suspicion for their different beliefs and practices. What followed was a brutal persecution. Christians were tortured, crucified, and burned alive as human torches at public festivities. Nero turned these atrocities into spectacles, feeding his own ego while terrorizing the empire. The young emperor, who once seemed full of potential, had become a symbol of cruelty and misrule. Nero was no longer the boy who ascended the throne to applause. He was now feared and hated. His name echoed not as a promise but as a curse. Before continuing, I noticed you haven't subscribed to the channel yet. You won't want to miss all the content about Rome we regularly bring to you. Nero was born in AD 37 in the city of Antium, about 50 kilometers from Rome. His birth name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and he belonged to one of the most influential families in Roman aristocracy. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was known for his controversial reputation, marked by accusations of treason, adultery, and even incest. Despite his noble lineage, Gnaeus died when Nero was just 2 years old, leaving him fatherless and creating an opportunity for his mother, Agrippina the Younger, to take full control of his life. Agrippina the Younger was an extraordinarily ambitious and strategic woman. The daughter of Germanicus, one of Rome's most revered generals, and the great niece of Augustus, she had a deep understanding of political power and how to manipulate it. However, her initial position was not one of great influence. After her husband's death, she faced years of hardship, worsened by the erratic behavior of her brother, Emperor Caligula. At a critical moment, Agrippina was exiled for participating in a conspiracy to assassinate Caligula, leaving Nero in the care of an aunt. When Caligula was assassinated in AD 41, Claudius took the throne, and Agrippina's fortunes began to change. Claudius, a scholarly man but considered weak and susceptible to influence, quickly became the target of Agrippina's ambition. She returned to Rome and used her political skills to restore her social standing. Taking advantage of the vacuum left by the execution of Claudius's wife, Messalina, for treason, Agrippina approached the emperor with the aim of becoming his new wife. Although the marriage between uncle and niece was viewed with some discomfort by Roman society, Agrippina managed to convince the Senate and the elite to accept the union. Her marriage to Claudius in AD 49 was a strategic coup that solidified Agrippina's return to the center of power. From that moment, her absolute priority was to secure her son Nero's future on the imperial throne. Agrippina skillfully manipulated Claudius into adopting Nero as his son and naming him heir to the empire. As part of this process, Nero received an exemplary education, supervised by one of Rome's greatest intellectuals, the Stoic philosopher Seneca. This training was essential to prepare the young man for the role of ruler, while reinforcing Agrippina's image as a devoted mother and political strategist. In the years that followed, Agrippina consolidated her influence within the empire. She cultivated important alliances in the Senate and used her new position as empress to promote her family's power. Under her supervision, Nero was integrated into the inner circle of government and began to be seen as Claudius's natural successor, ahead of Britannicus, the emperor's biological son with Messalina. This maneuver created tensions in the court, but Agrippina proved relentless in eliminating any threats to her son's future. The relationship between mother and son, initially marked by cooperation and affection, played a central role in Nero's early life and political rise. Agrippina controlled decisions and kept the court aligned with her interests, ensuring Nero was prepared to assume the throne at the right moment. However, this level of control planted the seeds of a rivalry that would intensify as soon as Nero became emperor, marking the beginning of a turbulent period for Rome and the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Let me know in the comments what you think about Nero as an emperor. I want to hear your opinion. The relationship between Nero and his mother, Agrippina, began as a powerful partnership. From the start, she was the driving force behind his rise to the throne, manipulating alliances, eliminating rivals, and ensuring the young man had the most promising future possible. But over time, this partnership turned into a battle of wills, a growing storm that would end in one of the darkest episodes in Rome's history. When Nero became emperor, he was young, inexperienced, and dependent on his mother. Agrippina was absolutely certain that her son would be an extension of her own ambition, ruling Rome under her constant supervision. In the early years, this worked. She guided him in everything, from political decisions to the subtler aspects of administering the empire. But Nero, growing under the pressure of power and responsibility, began to realize that he didn't want to be just the obedient son of the empress. He wanted to be the sole ruler of Rome. The drift began as a gentle breeze before the storm. Nero gradually started to ignore his mother's advice, preferring to rely on his own instincts and those of his closest allies, such as the philosopher Seneca. Agrippina, on the other hand, was not willing to lose control. She had sacrificed too much, played too high, to simply accept being cast aside. She tried to reaffirm her position, demanding respect and obedience. But Nero, now more confident in the power he wielded, began to resist. Things worsened when Nero began a romance with Poppaea Sabina, a woman as ambitious as he was. Poppaea saw Agrippina as an enemy, someone who needed to be removed so she could consolidate her own influence over the emperor. Agrippina, furious, confronted Nero, demanding that he abandon Poppaea. In a moment of anger, she even hinted that Britannicus, the legitimate son of Claudius, should take the throne instead of Nero. For Nero, this was more than an affront. It was a threat. The tension between the two turned into a direct confrontation. Nero began removing Agrippina's allies from positions of power, isolating her more and more, but she didn't back down. Ever astute, Agrippina started planting rumors at court, trying to destabilize Nero's position. He, in turn, became obsessed with the idea that his mother was plotting his downfall. To him, the only solution was extreme. Agrippina had to be eliminated. Nero decided to act. He planned what would be a death disguised as an accident. A boat was constructed with the purpose of sinking at sea, taking Agrippina with it. The plan seemed perfect. She would be invited on a trip, the boat would sink, and her death would be seen as an unexpected tragedy. But what Nero didn't foresee was his mother's resilience. When the boat began to sink, Agrippina managed to escape, swimming to the shore with the same determination that had always guided her in life. The failure of the plan threw Nero into a panic. He knew that Agrippina was now aware of his betrayal, which made her even more dangerous. With no alternatives, he abandoned any attempt at subtlety. Nero sent soldiers to his mother's house with direct orders to kill her. According to accounts, Agrippina faced her assassins with courage, telling them to strike wherever they wanted, for she had given birth to Nero. With Agrippina's death, Nero achieved what he wanted. He was free to rule without interference, but this freedom came at a price. The image of a son who murdered his own mother spread throughout Rome, irreversibly tarnishing his reputation. More than that, the act seemed to open the door to a new phase in his reign, one marked by paranoia, cruelty, and increasingly self-destructive decisions. Agrippina's shadow would never leave Nero. Even in her absence, she continued to haunt him, a constant reminder of what he had done and who he had become. The relationship between mother and son, which began as an unbreakable alliance, ended as one of the most tragic chapters in the history of the Roman Empire. What do you think of Nero's story so far? Before we continue, I noticed you forgot to like the video. Help us keep bringing you more content about Rome. In AD 64, Rome was devastated by a catastrophic fire. The blaze began in the area of the Great Circus, a region filled with markets and wooden structures that made it highly flammable. Fueled by strong winds and the lack of effective measures to control such an immense fire, the flames quickly spread through the narrow streets of the city. For 6 days, the fire ruthlessly consumed temples, homes, and businesses, leaving a trail of destruction. Of Rome's 14 districts, 3 were completely destroyed, while 7 suffered severe damage. Thousands of people lost everything, including their homes, belongings, and in many cases their lives. The social impact was devastating. Homeless citizens crowded into makeshift camps, while the smoldering ruins of the city stood as a grim reminder of the tragedy. The traumatized population began to search for answers. Amid the chaos, rumors started to circulate, and a grave accusation gained traction. Nero, the emperor, had ordered the fire. Some accounts suggested he intended to clear land for the construction of a new luxurious palace, later known as the Domus Aurea. Other, more shocking accusations claimed that Nero watched the city burn while playing his lyre. Although these stories remain unproven, they reflect the growing distrust between the people and their ruler. Facing a legitimacy crisis and fearing a popular revolt, Nero decided to blame the Christians, a marginalized religious minority. At the time, Christians were viewed with suspicion for refusing to worship Roman gods and for their practices, which were considered strange. By shifting the blame to this group, Nero sought to divert attention from himself and regain the trust of the people. The persecution of Christians was brutal and systematic. Hundreds of people were arrested, many of whom were tortured to confess to crimes they had not committed. Executions were carried out publicly, with methods designed to intimidate and entertain the population. Some Christians were thrown to wild beasts in the Colosseum, while others were crucified. One of the most macabre methods involved tying the condemned to poles, covering them in flammable resin, and setting them ablaze as human torches to light Nero's gardens during evening events. These scenes of cruelty shocked both Romans and foreign observers. At the same time, Nero began a massive project to rebuild the city. He introduced new regulations such as widening streets and constructing stone buildings in an attempt to prevent similar disasters in the future. However, the reforms came at a high cost. To fund the reconstruction, Nero raised taxes in various provinces, provoking discontent among local governors and the Roman elite. Despite his efforts to restore his image, the political and social consequences of the fire and the persecutions continued to haunt Nero. Many citizens did not believe in his innocence regarding the fire and saw his actions as a desperate attempt to control a narrative that had already spiraled out of his control. The massacre of Christians, while initially perceived as an act of strength, ultimately generated sympathy for the religious community, which grew in numbers and influence in the decades that followed. The Great Fire of Rome in AD 64 was a turning point in Nero's reign. It not only marked the beginning of his political decline, but also exposed his inability to handle crises without resorting to violence and manipulation. The event solidified his reputation as a cruel and reckless leader, leaving an indelible mark on the history of the Roman Empire. And don't forget to grab your digital book, 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. It's crucial to get it now before the copies run out. Imagine a city burned and devastated, with thousands of homeless people wandering among ruins and ashes. This was Rome after the Great Fire of AD 64. While the citizens still mourned their losses, Nero saw an opportunity to transform the tragedy into his vision of grandeur. He wanted to rebuild Rome like never before, with wider streets, fire-resistant buildings, and monuments that would immortalize his name. But there was a problem: money. The empire's coffers were already strained, and the astronomical costs of reconstruction demanded drastic measures. Nero decided to raise taxes across all Roman provinces. Farmers, merchants, and artisans began to feel the weight of the extra charges. For many, this meant sacrificing what little they had, selling land, livestock, and even their own freedoms to pay what was demanded. However, taxes were not enough. To finance his ambitions, Nero made another risky decision: devaluing the currency. He reduced the amount of silver in coins, creating more money to spend. At first, this seemed like an effective solution, but Romans soon realized its devastating effects. The prices of food and basic goods soared, while the real value of the currency plummeted. A loaf of bread that once cost a small fraction of a worker's wage now became a luxury. In the provinces, discontent grew rapidly. Governors were pressured to send more tributes to Rome, forcing local populations to bear the consequences. In Gaul, Hispania, and other regions, whispers of dissatisfaction began to turn into movements of resistance. Local leaders, tired of Nero's demands, started withholding tributes and even questioning his authority. In Rome, the situation was equally unstable. The streets were filled with rumors. The senatorial elite, also suffering from inflation, began conspiring in silence. Many senators, already resentful of Nero's extravagant lifestyle, saw the economic crisis as proof of his inability to govern. To them, the emperor was more focused on building his golden palace, the Domus Aurea, than on solving the empire's problems. And Nero, the man at the center of this storm, seemed increasingly detached from reality. He devoted himself to artistic projects, organized grand festivals, and made public appearances where he sang and played the lyre. To the people, these events were not a sign of his greatness, but of his disconnection from the misery around him. While Rome was being rebuilt with bricks and marble, the social fabric of the empire began to crumble. The increased taxes and devalued currency not only impoverished the Romans, but also fueled a wave of dissatisfaction that united all social classes. Rich and poor, patricians and plebeians, everyone had something to lose under Nero's rule. And so, while he sought to leave his name engraved in history, he sowed the seeds of his own downfall. Tell me in the comments, do you believe Nero was Rome's worst emperor? Do you think there was someone better or worse? In AD 65, Nero committed one of the most brutal acts of his personal life by murdering his wife Poppaea Sabina. Historical accounts report that Poppaea, pregnant at the time, was killed during a fit of rage by the emperor, who fatally assaulted her during an argument. This episode highlighted not only Nero's violent temperament, but also the emotional instability that characterized his relationship with Poppaea. Her death was seen as a tragic event, not only because of the circumstances in which it occurred, but also due to the political and social impact it had on the Roman court. Poppaea was not a secondary figure in the political landscape of Rome. She was known for her beauty, intelligence, and political acumen. Ambitious, she managed to earn Nero's trust, eliminate rivals, and position herself as one of the most influential women in the empire. Her relationship with the emperor was marked by passion and power, but also by intense conflict. The loss of Poppaea not only destabilized Nero emotionally, but also undermined part of his support base, as she played a significant role in consolidating political alliances. After Poppaea's death, Nero exhibited behaviors widely interpreted as signs of his growing disconnection from reality. Among the most controversial was his relationship with Sporus, a young man he ordered to be castrated and with whom he held a marriage ceremony. Sporus, according to accounts, bore a striking physical resemblance to Poppaea, leading many to believe that Nero was attempting to recreate the presence of his deceased wife. The marriage to Sporus followed traditional rituals, with Nero playing the role of the groom and treating the young man as if he were his legitimate wife. He even took Sporus to public events, presenting him as the empress, an act that caused shock and outrage among Romans. Even in a society relatively permissive of certain social practices, the idea of an emperor marrying a castrated man and dressing him as a woman was widely seen as an affront to Roman traditions and the dignity of the imperial office. Nero's actions during this period were not isolated. They reflected a pattern of behavior combining extravagance, impulsiveness, and disregard for social and political norms. The death of Poppaea and the marriage to Sporus were interpreted as evidence of an increasingly unhinged emperor, detached from the expectations of his people and his court. These events significantly contributed to the deterioration of Nero's reputation, not only among the senatorial elite, but also among the common people. The image of a ruler who killed his own wife and then married a castrated young man symbolized for many the moral decadence of the regime. Internally, this fueled conspiracies against him as senators and provincial governors questioned his ability to govern. The growing dissatisfaction solidified the perception that Nero was no longer just an eccentric leader, but a ruler, threatening the empire's stability with his reckless and disrespectful actions. By AD 68, the empire Nero had ruled for over a decade was beginning to crumble before his eyes. Tension filled the air, and the provinces, once tightly controlled, now seethed with discontent. In Gaul, one man dared to challenge the emperor's absolute power. That man was Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of the province of Gallia Lugdunensis. Tired of seeing the people oppressed by exorbitant taxes and demoralized by Nero's chaotic behavior, Vindex rose against him, openly declaring his rebellion. The revolt was not just an act of courage, but also a call to the rest of the empire. Vindex didn't just want to depose Nero, he wanted to inspire other provincial leaders to join the fight against the emperor. "Enough of tyranny," was the cry echoing through Gaul as he rallied powerful figures to the cause. His message found receptive ears, especially in Hispania, where an influential governor named Galba began planning his own moves against Nero. Meanwhile, in Rome, Nero seemed oblivious to the growing danger. He remained absorbed in his artistic performances and lavish banquets, believing his position as emperor was unshakable. However, rumors of rebellion began to spread, and signs of discontent reached his doorstep. The first major betrayal came from where he least expected, the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard was the elite force that protected the emperor, an essential pillar of his security and authority. For years, Nero trusted them blindly, believing their loyalty was guaranteed. But in AD 68, that trust was broken. The prefect of the guard, one of Nero's closest confidants, abandoned him and joined the conspirators. This act was not just a desertion, it was a symbol that Nero was increasingly isolated. Without the Praetorian Guard by his side, his vulnerability was exposed. As Nero's allies deserted him, his support base crumbled like a house of cards. Provincial governors, sensing the emperor's weakness, began transferring their allegiance to Galba, who now presented himself as an alternative to the throne. The armies that once obeyed Nero's orders began to hesitate. Many questioned why they should fight for an emperor who seemed more interested in his art than in leading the empire. The final blow came with the loss of military control. Nero attempted to order mobilizations and demand loyalty, but his commands were ignored. The soldiers, who had not been adequately paid due to the economic crisis, saw no reason to support a leader who had abandoned them to pursue his own pleasures. With each passing day, Nero grew more isolated, and his authority as emperor evaporated before his eyes. When news of Vindex's rebellion spread, and the defection of key allies became evident, Nero finally realized his reign was on the brink of collapse. His once unshakable confidence gave way to fear and desperation. The man who had ruled with extravagance and arrogance now found himself isolated in his own palace, betrayed by those who had once sworn to protect him. The empire was moving against him, and the inevitable end of his reign was drawing ever closer. As Nero's allies deserted him, his support base crumbled like a house of cards. Provincial governors, sensing the emperor's weakness, began transferring their loyalty to Galba, who now presented himself as an alternative to the throne. The armies that had once obeyed Nero's orders began to hesitate. Many questioned why they should fight for an emperor who seemed more interested in his art than in leading the empire. The final blow came with the loss of military control. Nero attempted to order mobilizations and demand loyalty, but his orders were ignored. The soldiers, who were no longer receiving adequate pay due to the economic crisis, saw no reason to support a leader who had abandoned them to pursue his own pleasures. With each passing day, Nero became more isolated, and his authority as emperor evaporated before his eyes. When news of Vindex's rebellion spread and the defection of important allies became evident, Nero finally realized his reign was on the brink of collapse. His once unshakable confidence gave way to fear and despair. The man who had ruled with extravagance and arrogance now found himself isolated in his own palace, betrayed by those who had once sworn to protect him. The empire was moving against him, and the inevitable end of his reign was drawing closer. Without allies, without an army, and completely isolated, Nero found himself at a dead end in AD 68. Abandoned even by those closest to him, the emperor realized that the empire he had once ruled with extravagance now completely rejected him. Faced with the threat of capture and execution, Nero decided to take his own life. At just 30 years old, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended his life, closing an era of rule that began with Augustus and ended in tragedy. Nero's death was met with relief in Rome. The people, who had endured his reign marked by tyranny, scandals, and extravagance, celebrated the end of his rule, but his death also left the empire in a precarious situation. Without a direct successor, Rome plunged into a period of instability known as the Year of the Four Emperors, during which different leaders vied for control of the throne. So it's clear that Nero truly was the cruelest emperor Rome ever had. His actions left deep scars on the empire and serve as a reminder of how absolute power can corrupt completely. But his story isn't just about destruction, it's a warning about how a leader's choices can impact millions of lives. And remember, whenever you want to learn in a simple way how Rome became the incredible civilization it was, just go to the pinned comment and get your digital book, 10 Battles That Shaped the Roman Empire. Get it today, because copies are limited. If you enjoyed this dive into history and want to know more about what happened after Nero, don't forget to like this video. Also, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as there's plenty of fascinating history coming your way. This way you won't miss a single detail about the most controversial and intriguing figures of ancient Rome. See you in the next video.